What would you do if the person you trusted most betrayed you at your most vulnerable moment? Chloe was alone in her car. The faint glow of the dashboard cast a soft shadow over her face, which was streaked with tears. Her fingers trembled as she fiddled with her engagement ring, twisting it over and over, a nervous habit she hadn't realized she'd picked up. She stared through the windscreen, her gaze unfocused, her mind reliving the moment that had shattered her heart just hours ago. She had followed Dan that night, her instincts gnawing at her, urging her to confirm the suspicions she had tried so hard to push away. And there he was, sitting across from a younger woman in a secluded booth at their favorite restaurant, the place where they had celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, and even the news of her pregnancy. The laughter that spilled from their table felt like a slap in the face. Dan leaned in close, whispering something that made the woman laugh, his hand lightly brushing hers. It wasn't just dinner. It wasn't innocent. Chloe's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the memory replayed. She had felt paralyzed in that moment, unable to breathe, unable to look away. Her heart had pounded so hard she thought it might burst, each beat echoing with betrayal. She had wanted to storm in, to demand answers, to scream at him, at her, at the universe for allowing this to happen. But instead, she had driven away, her chest tight with a pain so deep it threatened to consume her completely. Now, sitting in the stillness of the car in a quiet Melbourne suburb, the silence was almost unbearable. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jumper, but the tears kept coming. Her hand fell to her growing belly, and she closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. "It's not just about me anymore," she whispered to herself. "I have to think about you now." Her other hand instinctively cupped her stomach, a protective gesture that made the heartbreak feel sharper, more unbearable. After what felt like hours, she finally started the car and drove home. The bittersweet memory of how it all began still played vividly in Chloe's mind. Like scenes from a favorite movie, she couldn't force herself to stop watching, even when it hurt. Back then, their love story had felt effortless, like something written in the stars. She still remembered the exact moment she met Dan. Her heart had fluttered when he smiled at her from across the room at a university fundraiser. She hadn't even wanted to attend that night, but her housemate had convinced her to go, insisting she needed to network and have some fun. Chloe had awkwardly hovered near the refreshment table, sipping a glass of lemonade and trying to look busy. And then Dan appeared, his tie slightly askew, and an easy smile on his face as he grabbed a plate of party pies. "Not much of a party, is it?" he said, gesturing to the sparse crowd of students milling about. His voice was warm, friendly, and completely disarming. Chloe looked up, surprised someone was talking to her. "Yeah, not exactly the social event of the year," she replied, smiling shyly. "I'm Dan," he said, extending a hand. "Chloe," she said, shaking it. His grip was firm, but not overpowering, and for some reason, that small detail stuck with her. They spent the rest of the night talking, laughing about how neither of them really wanted to be there and swapping stories about their lives. He told her about his love for footy and how he worked part-time at the campus library to save up for law school. She told him about her passion for art history and how she dreamed of curating exhibits at a big city museum someday. "What's your dream exhibit?" he had asked, leaning against the wall, his eyes genuinely curious. She had hesitated, feeling a little silly. "It's kind of niche," she admitted, "but I'd love to put something together about how everyday objects tell stories, like a simple teacup set or an old pair of shoes. They can tell you so much about the lives of the people who owned them." Dan had smiled, and it wasn't a condescending smile, but one that made her feel like he truly understood. "That's not silly," he said. "That's fascinating. You'd be amazing at that." It was a small moment, but it stuck with her. And from then on, Dan was everywhere in her life. They went on their first date a week later, A simple coffee date at a small cafe in a laneway near campus. The kind of place with wobbly tables and mismatched chairs, where the barista always seemed a little grumpy, but made the best cappuccinos Chloe had ever tasted. "Okay, serious question," Dan had said. "If you could only eat one meal for the rest of your life, what would it be?" "That's easy, pizza," Chloe said, without missing a beat. "You can put anything on it, so it's versatile, and it's delicious." Dan laughed, shaking his head. "That's cheating. The toppings can't change." "Then I guess I'd starve," she said, with a dramatic shrug, and they both burst into laughter. Those early days were filled with moments like that, effortless, full of laughter and connection. They spent entire nights walking through the campus gardens, talking about everything and nothing. He made her feel like she was the only person in the world who mattered, like her dreams were worth chasing. When Dan proposed 3 years later, it was under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights he had strung up in her parents' backyard in the Sydney suburbs. It was a warm summer night, the kind of night where the air felt thick with possibility. He had gotten down on one knee, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the small velvet box. "Chloe," he began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy in his eyes. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. You've made my life brighter, better, and full of meaning. I can't imagine my future without you. Will you marry me?" She had cried, of course. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded furiously. "Yes," she managed to say through her sobs. "Yes, Dan, of course." The guests who had been hiding in the house came out, cheering as Dan slid the ring onto her finger. It had been one of those perfect moments she thought only happened in movies. They danced under the lights that night, barefoot and dizzy with emotion, dreaming aloud of the life they would build together. Those memories had been a source of comfort, a reminder of how strong their bond had once been. But now, as Chloe sat alone in the stillness of her home, those same memories felt like sharp reminders of what she had lost, of how far they had drifted from the couple who once danced barefoot under the stars. Their first flat was small, a little run down, and perfect in every way that mattered. Chloe still remembered the way Dan had carried her over the threshold on the day they moved in, laughing as he lightly bumped her head on the doorframe. "Sorry," he said, smiling as he set her down. "Not exactly the grand entrance I had planned." "That's okay," she said, brushing the dust from her jeans as she looked around the empty space. "It's ours, right? That's all that matters." They spent that first night on a mattress on the floor, eating takeaway straight from the containers, because they hadn't unpacked any dishes yet. Chloe had laughed so hard when Dan accidentally spilled soy sauce on the carpet that her sides ached. "I guess we'll have to invest in a rug sooner than we thought," he quipped, and he leaned in to kiss her, his lips tasting faintly of sesame chicken. Over the next few weeks, they made the space their own, painting the walls a soft yellow in the living room and hanging mismatched curtains Chloe found on sale. They spent hours rearranging the second-hand furniture they had scored, debating where the couch should go, until Dan finally threw up his hands and said, "You pick. You're better at this than I am." One night, while they were unpacking the last box, their favorite song came on the radio. Dan stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and held out a hand to her. "May I have this dance?" "Here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, but already smiling. "Right here," he said, pulling her to her feet. They danced barefoot on the scratched hardwood floor, the light from a single lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. Chloe rested her head on his chest, swaying to the rhythm of the music, and in that moment, everything felt simple and perfect. Their life wasn't without its challenges, of course. There were late nights where Dan came home exhausted from work. Chloe would meet him at the door with a warm hug, pressing a mug of tea into his hands while he vented about a difficult client or a project that went wrong. "You've got this," she would tell him, her voice firm and confident. "You always do." And then there were the times when it was her turn to lean on him. When she didn't get the promotion she had worked so hard for, Dan held her as she cried, stroking her hair and whispering, "They don't know what they're missing. You're incredible, Chloe. Don't let this stop you." They were a team. They balanced each other out in a way that felt natural, effortless. For every setback, there was a victory. Small triumphs they celebrated together, like finding the perfect throw pillows for the couch, or finally saving enough money to replace the ancient microwave that sparked every time they used it. Then came the moment that changed everything. Chloe had been feeling off for days, tired, a little dizzy. Her emotions had been swinging wildly from one extreme to the other. At first, she had chalked it up to stress. But then she realized her period was late. Sitting in the bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her hands, she felt a mix of emotions so overwhelming it took her breath away. Excitement, fear, joy, uncertainty. When Dan came home that night, she could barely contain herself. "I need to show you something," she blurted out, grabbing his hand and pulling him to the kitchen. "It's okay," he said, laughing. "What's the rush?" She handed him the test, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, he just stared at it, his brow furrowed as he processed what it meant. Then, his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. She felt the tears welling up in her eyes. "We're having a baby." Dan lifted her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen. "We're having a baby," he repeated, laughing as if he couldn't believe it. The following weeks were a blur of preparation and excitement. Chloe threw herself into creating the perfect nursery, picking out soft pastel paints and tiny clothes that made her heart swell just looking at them. Dan teased her for agonizing over which cot to buy, but he was just as involved, assembling furniture late into the night and proudly showing her his work. One night, as they folded baby clothes together, Chloe held up a tiny onesie and smiled. "Can you believe that someone so small is going to change our entire world?" Dan looked at her, his eyes soft. "I don't know how we got so lucky," he said softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But I know one thing. You're going to be the best mum." Her heart swelled, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. They were building a future together, one full of love, laughter, and the promise of something extraordinary. But what Chloe didn't know was that things were about to change. As Dan's career took off, so did the distance between them. At first, Chloe didn't think much of it. Promotions came with added responsibilities, and she understood the pressure he was under. "Just a few more late nights," he had said once, kissing her on the forehead as he grabbed his briefcase. "It's all for us, you know." She had believed him. After all, Dan had always been ambitious, and his drive was one of the things she had loved about him. But as the months went by, those few more late nights stretched into a pattern she couldn't ignore. The dinners she had carefully prepared grew cold on the table. The candles burned down to the wick as she sat alone, waiting. When he finally came home, he would offer a brief apology, his tone distracted, before retreating to his laptop or phone. "It's just work," he would say, ignoring her concern when she tried to talk about it. "You know how demanding everything is right now." At first, she tried to be understanding. She didn't want to be the clingy wife, the one who couldn't support her husband's success. But the little things started to add up. There was the receipt she found crumpled in his coat pocket for an expensive necklace from a downtown boutique. It had struck her immediately because Dan had always been thoughtful with gifts, but she couldn't remember receiving anything like that. She had turned it over in her hands, her stomach churning. "Hey," she had said casually that night, holding up the receipt while he sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "What's this for?" Dan looked up. His eyes landed on the paper before flicking back to his screen. "That?" he said dismissively. "It's nothing. A gift for a client. You know how it is." "For a client?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Since when do you buy jewelry for work?" "It's just a gesture," he snapped, his tone clipped. "Don't read too much into it, Chloe." She had let it go, but the sense of unease stayed, gnawing at her. Small moments like that began to accumulate, his phone buzzing late at night with messages he didn't bother to explain, the way he seemed to keep it close to him at all times now, even taking it into the bathroom. When she would glance over, she would catch him smiling at the screen, a soft, private expression that made her chest tighten. "Who is it?" she asked once, trying to sound casual. "Just work stuff," he said, quickly locking the screen and putting the phone face down on the table. "You seem very happy with work these days," she said, forcing a small laugh. But he didn't respond. His attention was already somewhere else. The warmth that had once filled their relationship felt like it was slipping through her fingers, replaced by a cold distance she didn't know how to bridge. She tried to reconnect, planning date nights and making his favorite meals, but he always had an excuse. Her suspicions reached a fever pitch one Friday night. Dan had promised to come home early. She spent hours making a special dinner, even setting the table with their best dishes and lighting the candles he had bought for their anniversary. She had been so hopeful, convinced that one quiet night together could rekindle the closeness they had once shared. But when 7 o'clock turned into 8 and then 9, she couldn't sit still any longer. She called him, but it went straight to voicemail. She sent him a text, her fingers trembling. "Are you okay?" His response came almost an hour later. "Sorry, got caught up at work. Don't wait up." But Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She went into their bedroom. Her eyes landed on his briefcase, which was sitting by the door. She hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding, as if she already knew she wouldn't like what she would find. Inside, she saw a printed itinerary for a work conference he had never mentioned, scheduled for the following weekend. The destination wasn't far, but what caught her eye was the handwritten note scribbled in the margin. "Make sure Alana has everything she needs for the trip. Alana." She stared at the name, her mind racing. She didn't know any Alana from Dan's office, but she had heard him mention the name once or twice recently, always in passing. She closed the briefcase carefully, her hands shaking, and sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Later that night, she heard him come home. He slipped into bed beside her without a word, his phone buzzing softly as he checked it one last time before setting it on the nightstand. Chloe lay there in the dark, her back to him, her eyes wide open. Her mind screamed with questions she didn't know how to ask. Her heart was breaking under the weight of what she was beginning to suspect. She wanted to believe it wasn't what it looked like. She wanted to believe that the man she had loved so deeply, the man she had entrusted with her heart and her future, was not capable of betraying her. But as she lay there, listening to his steady breathing, she couldn't ignore the feeling that the life they had built was beginning to crack, and she had no idea how to stop it from falling apart. One day, the unease had grown too much to bear. Chloe had spent hours pacing the house, her mind racing with every possibility. And then, without fully deciding, she found herself grabbing her keys and stepping out into the cool night air. She hadn't planned this, not really. It was instinct that had led her there, following Dan after another one of his vague excuses about a late meeting. She told herself it was just to ease the persistent voice in her head, the one that whispered things she didn't want to believe. Her heart sank when she saw him pull into the small restaurant parking lot, the one they used to visit for their date nights. She parked a few spaces away, her pulse quickening as she watched him get out of his car. He smoothed down his jacket, checked his phone, and then, there she was, a younger woman dressed effortlessly in a chic dress, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, walked up to Dan with a smile that made Chloe's stomach twist. He returned the smile, the easy, familiar one that used to be hers. Chloe's breath caught as she watched him lean in slightly, his hand brushing the woman's back as they walked in together. She sat frozen in her car, unable to move, unable to breathe. The windscreen felt like a barrier between her and the truth that was unfolding in front of her. Her mind raced, searching for another explanation. Maybe it's really a work thing, maybe it's nothing. But deep down, she knew. She had known for weeks, maybe longer. But seeing it, seeing him, was like having the floor ripped out from under her. Her hands shook as she reached for the car door handle. Every part of her screamed to go in, to demand answers, to make a scene that would end the lies. But she didn't. Her fingers hovered, then pulled back, and she let the door close. Confronting him now wouldn't fix anything, she realized. Not like this. Instead, she sat there in silence, watching as the lights from inside the restaurant cast a warm glow on their table near the window. Dan laughed at something the woman said, his head tilted slightly as he leaned in closer. Chloe swallowed hard, her throat tight. The man she thought she knew, the man she had shared a life with, felt like a stranger. Her heart ached. But even more than that, it burned. She didn't know how long she sat there before she finally started the car and drove home. The house was silent when she walked in, the kind of silence that felt empty, as if the walls themselves were aware of what had just happened. She put her purse on the counter, her movements slow and deliberate, as if rushing would only make the pain hit harder. The ultrasound picture on the fridge caught her eye, the small black and white image she had looked at every morning with a mix of wonder and hope. She walked over to it, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the picture. Her reflection looked back at her from the glossy surface of the fridge, eyes puffy, cheeks streaked with tears, and an expression she barely recognized. She wanted to fall apart right then and there, to let the weight of the betrayal drag her to the floor. But then her hand fell to her stomach, and she felt the faint flutter of a movement, a reminder of the life growing inside her. It wasn't just about her anymore. Her fingers released the picture, and something inside her shifted. The despair in her chest began to harden into something else. Determination. It wasn't an instant transformation. As she moved through the house, her steps led her to the nursery. It was still a work in progress. The walls painted a soft grey, a cot half assembled in the corner, a pile of unopened baby books on the dresser. She sat down on the edge of the rocking chair, her hands trembling, as she picked up a small baby blanket she had folded just days ago. She held it to her face, inhaling the faint scent of lavender fabric softener. Tears came again, uninvited, as she held the blanket close. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You deserve so much more than this." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. Her breathing quickened. She looked around the room at the unfinished little signs of the life she was preparing to welcome. Without thinking, she moved to the living room. Her gaze landed on the shelf filled with photo albums. The memories that once brought her joy now felt like ghosts mocking her. She took down the first album, the one filled with photos from their wedding. The smiling faces, the vows exchanged, the promises made. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, but her resolve did not waver. One by one, she packed the albums into a box, her movements firm despite the tears streaking her cheeks. It wasn't an act of erasure, it was an act of survival. She needed space to breathe, to think, to figure out her next steps. Dan had made his choices, and now she would make hers. When the last album was packed away, she sat down on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. The room felt heavier now, the weight of her decisions settling in. She stood up, wiping the tears from her face. There was no room for despair, not now. She had a plan to make, a life to protect. And as much as it hurt, she wouldn't let Dan's betrayal define her story. This was only the beginning. Chloe sat at the small desk in the corner of her bedroom. The soft glow of the lamp cast long shadows in the room. The silent hum of the baby monitor on the nightstand filled the silence as she stared at the screen of her laptop. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, before she took a deep breath and clicked save on the folder she had created. The folder was labeled Dan Evidence. Her heart ached with each file she added. Photos, screenshots of messages she had discreetly forwarded to herself. Copies of receipts she had found tucked away in his briefcase. Each piece was a painful reminder of what he had done. But Chloe forced herself to focus. She needed this, not for revenge, but for protection. For her baby. She looked at the picture of them on her desk, an image from happier times. They were laughing, their arms around each other, the world at their feet. She turned it face down, unable to bear the sight. That version of Dan no longer existed, if he ever had. Her preparations had begun the night she followed him to the restaurant. After returning home, she had stayed up until dawn, her mind racing. In the morning, she had made a decision. If Dan thought he could continue to live a double life, she would show him he was wrong. But she wouldn't confront him. Not yet. Confrontation was too easy, too predictable. She needed a plan. The next day, she bought a small camera online, one that could be hidden in her purse. When it arrived, she nervously, awkwardly fumbled with the settings until she got it right. The first time she used it was outside Dan's office. She parked across the street. The camera angled just enough to catch him leaving the building. When Alana appeared moments later, her hand brushing his arm as they walked to his car, Chloe's heart sank. But she didn't cry. Not this time. "Stay focused," she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tight. "You can't afford to." She followed him to another restaurant, taking photos from her car as they laughed over dinner. The betrayal stung, but she forced herself to see it for what it was. Evidence. She no longer needed to justify her actions. She knew the truth, and now she was making sure others would too. Over the next few weeks, Chloe began consulting with a lawyer. The office was small and quiet, the walls lined with shelves of thick law books. The lawyer, a woman in her late 40s named Karen, listened intently as Chloe explained her situation, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "I need to protect my baby," Chloe said, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. "I can't let Dan use this against me. Not when he's the one who—" She paused, swallowing hard. "Not when he's the one who betrayed us." Karen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're doing the right thing by documenting everything," she said. "The court will take the infidelity and emotional abandonment into account when deciding on custody and support. We'll make sure you and your child are safe." Hearing those words gave Chloe a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she wasn't as powerless as she had felt. She left the office with a folder of legal documents and a renewed sense of determination. At home, she forced herself to act normally around Dan. It wasn't easy. Every time she saw him check his phone, every time he came home late with a flimsy excuse, her chest tightened with the urge to scream. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled. She asked him about his day and pretended not to notice when he stumbled over his words. Late at night, after Dan had fallen asleep, she would sit at her desk, going over her notes and organizing her files. The sound of his steady breathing from the bedroom felt distant, almost unreal, like an echo from another life. She knew it wouldn't be long before everything came to a head, before the carefully constructed world Dan had created for himself came crashing down. But as Chloe methodically prepared her case, one painful piece at a time, another story was unfolding in parallel, one that Dan thought he could keep hidden. The confrontation. The office was quiet after hours, the usual hum of phones and chatter replaced by the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. Alana sat at her desk, her head tilted slightly as she stared at the spreadsheet in front of her. She was the last person still working. Well, except for Dan. He appeared in the doorway of her cubicle, leaning casually against the frame with a coffee mug in his hand. "Still here," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "I'm starting to think you might live in this office." Alana looked up. A small smile appeared on her lips. "You're one to talk," she replied, gesturing to his tie, still hanging loosely around his neck. "You're here as much as I am," he chuckled, walking in. "Touché," he said, setting the coffee on her desk. "I thought you might need this. You've been staring at that screen for hours." She blinked in surprise. "Oh, thank you. That's really nice of you." "Just looking out for my favorite colleague," he said, winking. There was an ease to his tone, a charm that made it hard not to smile back. Alana had always found Dan approachable, despite his higher position in the company. He had a way of making her feel seen, like her work actually mattered. They fell into an easy conversation as they worked together on the remaining tasks. Dan was funny, witty, and attentive, asking about her goals and ideas in a way that felt genuine. Over time, their late-night collaborations turned into a pattern. He would stop by her desk with coffee, crack a few jokes to lighten the mood, and stay to help her finish whatever project was on the edge. "You're too good at this," she said one night, watching him effortlessly edit a presentation. "I don't know how you manage to juggle it all." He shrugged, his smile a little nostalgic. "You just find a way, I guess. It's not always easy, but when you're building something worthwhile, you make sacrifices." His words resonated with her. She nodded slowly, her fingers toying with her pen. "I get that. Sometimes I feel like my whole life is on hold for this job, but I don't know. I want it to mean something." Dan looked at her. His expression softened. "It will," he said. "You have determination, Alana. I've seen it. You're going to do amazing things." She felt her cheeks warm at his words. "Thanks, Dan. That means a lot." As the weeks went on, Alana found herself looking forward to their late-night conversations. Dan had a way of making her laugh, even on the most stressful days. But there were moments, small and fleeting, that made her pause. The way his eyes lingered on her when she laughed, the subtle compliments he would slip into their conversations, the easy, natural way he would lean in closer when they talked. One night, while they were finishing yet another project, Alana finally spoke up. "Dan," she began, hesitantly, putting his pen down. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, leaning back in his chair. She hesitated, biting her lip. "This? Us working together so much? It's starting to feel like, I don't know, like there's something more. And I don't want to assume anything, but are you—" She trailed off, her voice dropping. "I mean, are you single?" Dan's expression shifted for a brief moment. Something unsaid flickered in his eyes. But then he smiled, leaning in slightly. "It's complicated," he said softly. "I'm in the process of getting a divorce." Alana's heart both sank and soared at once. Divorced, not married, not truly unavailable. She nodded slowly, trying to process what that meant. "I see," she said carefully. "I didn't realize." It's not something I talk about much, Dan said, his tone serious. But things haven't been right for a long time. We've just grown apart, you know. I've been trying to figure out the best way to move forward. Alana searched his face, wanting to believe him. That must be difficult, she said softly. I'm so sorry you're going through that. He reached out, his hand lightly brushing hers. Thank you, Alana. It's been a lot, but you've made things easier. These late nights are the best part of my day. Her chest tightened at his words, her heart racing. She wanted to be cautious, to protect herself, but the way he was looking at her made it hard to hold on to that caution. He seemed genuine, sincere, and maybe even a little broken. Someone who needed comfort just as much as she did. Still, doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Are you sure this is okay? She asked softly. I don't want to be a part of anything messy. Dan smiled gently. It's not messy, he assured her. I promise you, I'm working on it. You don't have to worry. And with that, the doubts receded, at least for the moment. Alana allowed herself to believe him, to lean into the connection that had been building between them. She told herself that it was okay, that he was honest, that he wouldn't lie to her. She didn't know that Dan's promises were as fleeting as the stillness of the office late at night. They vanished as soon as the sun came up, and the reality of his life outside those walls came crashing back in. For now, all she saw was a man who seemed kind, attentive, and just as lonely as she was. And that, she thought, was enough. Dan's behavior grew more and more audacious, as if he had convinced himself that Chloe would never suspect a thing. He no longer bothered to hide his late nights or his sudden need for work trips. He walked through the house with a casual confidence that made Chloe's stomach churn. His phone buzzed constantly, the screen lighting up with messages that were never left unanswered. If she came into the room, he would press the screen to his chest or put it face down on the counter, offering a distracted smile. Each lie chipped away at the foundation of their marriage, but Chloe kept her mask firmly in place. She feigned ignorance, playing the part of the supportive wife, even as her heart broke a little more each day. When Dan announced he had to go on a work trip for the weekend, she didn't flinch, even though her gut felt like it was crumbling. "Where are you going?" she asked, folding one of his shirts and placing it neatly in his suitcase. "Just a conference up the coast," he replied, checking his phone again. "Boring stuff, really." She forced a small laugh. "Well, I hope it's not all boring. Maybe you'll have a little time to relax." "Maybe," he said, carelessly tossing a tie into the suitcase. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of the shirt she held. "Do you need me to pack anything else?" she asked softly. "No, this should be fine," he said, finally looking at her. "Thanks for doing this." "Of course," she said, her smile unwavering. "What are wives for?" The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she said them anyway. She closed the suitcase with deliberate care, zipping it shut, as Dan grabbed his phone and walked out of the room. Once he was gone, she sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap. The silence pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. Later that night, when the house was silent, Chloe found herself in the nursery. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the partially assembled cot and the pile of baby books on the dresser. She sank into the rocking chair, her hand resting on her growing belly. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought about the life she was bringing into the world, a life that deserved so much more than this fractured reality. Her tears fell freely as she took a small journal from the dresser. She opened it to a blank page, the pen trembling in her hand as she began to write. To my sweet baby, she scrawled, the ink smudging slightly where her tears hit the paper. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know one thing. I will do everything in my power to give you the life you deserve. You are my strength, my reason to keep going. I love you more than words can say. She closed the journal and held it to her chest. In the days that followed, she practiced in front of the mirror, rehearsing the words she would one day say to Dan. Her reflection looked back at her, pale and tired, but resolute. You betrayed me, she said aloud, her voice cracking. While I was busy building a life for us, you were busy tearing it apart. She paused, taking a shaky breath before starting again. I loved you, she said, her eyes fixed on her reflection. But love isn't enough when there's no trust, and now it's time for me to choose myself. She balled her hands into fists. Her reflection blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. This was her preparation, her armor for the day she finally confronted him. And when that day came, she would be ready. The reckoning. The living room was filled with soft laughter and the gentle hum of conversation as Chloe moved gracefully among her guests, a practiced smile on her face. The decorations were simple but elegant. White balloons, string lights, and fresh flowers that filled the air with a subtle, sweet fragrance. It seemed in all ways the perfect celebration of the new life she and Dan were supposedly preparing for. But beneath the surface, Chloe's heart pounded with the kind of anticipation that could only come from knowing that this wasn't just a party, it was something much bigger. She had planned every detail meticulously, from the guest list to the timing, making sure that everyone who mattered to Dan was there. His colleagues, his closest mates, even his parents. She wanted to create the perfect backdrop for what was about to happen. Everyone thought this was a baby shower, a joyful send-off into the couple's last few weeks before parenthood. Only Chloe knew the truth. Dan, always the charmer, played his part to perfection. He floated effortlessly between conversations, shaking hands with his colleagues, sharing a joke with her father-in-law, and occasionally glancing in Chloe's direction to flash what he thought was a reassuring smile. Every so often, he would wander over to her, placing a hand on her lower back as if to check in. "You okay?" he asked, refilling her glass with sparkling water. "I'm fine," she said, her tone calm and sweet, masking the fire that burned just beneath the surface. "Everything is going perfectly." He smiled, kissed her on the cheek, and walked away to join a group of his co-workers. Chloe watched him go. Her smile tightened as she returned to the task at hand. She looked at her phone. Her heart skipped a beat as the screen lit up with a notification. The message was from Alana. She had arrived. Chloe straightened her posture, smoothing the fabric of her dress. She had sent the anonymous invitation 2 weeks earlier, crafting it carefully to sound like something Dan might have written. Alana, eager for what she believed was a grand romantic gesture, had taken the bait. Chloe knew Alana would come dressed to impress, and she was right. The moment Alana walked into the room, heads turned. Alana looked stunning in a chic black dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her makeup flawless, her hair styled in loose waves. She hesitated in the doorway, scanning the crowd with an expectant smile, as if she were waiting for Dan to sweep her away. Chloe approached her slowly, her expression warm and welcoming. "Hello, you must be Alana," she said, her voice soft and polite. Alana blinked in surprise. She clearly hadn't expected Chloe to greet her. "Oh, yes," she said, her smile wavering slightly. I'm a friend of Dan's." "Of course," Lily said, nodding as if she didn't already know. "It's so nice to meet you. Dan's mentioned you before." Alana's eyes widened a little, her smile returning as she tried to process the situation. "He has?" she asked, her tone cautious but curious. "Oh, absolutely," Lily replied, gesturing to the room. "Please make yourself at home. This is a very special night for all of us." Alana looked around, clearly trying to understand why she was there, and what Dan's plan could possibly be. Chloe left her there, slipping back into the crowd as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She cast her gaze toward the crowd, searching until her eyes landed on Dan. A smile appeared on his face, small at first, then growing as if he had just seen something he had been longing to see. He made his way toward her, his steps confident, but with an undercurrent of hesitation. Dan saw her before she reached him, and the transformation in his expression was instantaneous. His face, which had been relaxed and jovial, went pale, as if all the color had been drained from it. His hand froze mid-gesture. The easy flow of his conversation stopped abruptly. He turned to her, as if by instinct. His eyes moved quickly around the room before he took a step forward to intercept her. "Alana," he said, his voice low, his tone a poor attempt at being casual. "What are you doing here?" Alana's smile wavered a little. Confusion flickered in her eyes. "I got your invitation," she said softly, glancing around the room again. "I didn't expect you to invite me here so soon. Are you sure this is okay?" Dan forced a laugh, his hand brushing her elbow as he guided her slightly away from the main crowd. "Of course," he said, though his words were rushed. The slightest tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Just be discreet, okay? This is just... discreet." "Dan, what is going on? This doesn't feel right." "Alana, please." He cut her off, his tone firmer now, though his eyes darted nervously toward Chloe, who was chatting with a group of guests on the other side of the room. "I'll explain everything later. Just trust me, okay?" Alana's lips tightened. The warmth in her expression dimmed slightly. "Fine," she said in a low voice. "But this isn't what I thought it was." Dan nodded quickly, cutting her off again. "I'll handle it," he said, his tone sharp but hushed. "Just don't draw attention to yourself." Alana took a deep breath, nodding reluctantly as she looked around the room once more. "Okay, I trust you." Dan offered a strained smile before turning back to the crowd. His movement was stiff, his charm no longer coming as naturally. Alana stood near the doorway, unsure of where to go or what to do, her confidence now overshadowed by doubt. Chloe, standing with her guests, caught the brief exchange out of the corner of her eye. Her chest tightened, but her face remained calm, her smile fixed. It was almost time, but not yet. She took a sip of her water, the cold liquid soothing her dry throat, and braced herself for the next move. Dan's moment of reckoning was closer than he realized, and Chloe intended to savor every second. After dinner, the room filled with a pleasant hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses as the guests settled into their seats. Chloe rose slowly, smoothing her dress as she moved to the center of the room. The soft glow of the chandelier above cast a warm light on her face, and she offered a quiet, gentle smile that belied the storm that raged inside her. "May I have everyone's attention, please?" she said, her voice firm yet soft. The murmur of voices quieted, and all eyes turned to her. Dan, sitting at the far end of the table, looked up with a gentle curiosity, his wineglass delicately balanced in his hand. Chloe caught his gaze for a brief moment before looking out at the crowd. "First, I just want to thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her tone measured and warm. "It means so much to both Dan and me to have our closest friends and family with us as we celebrate this new chapter in our lives." Her hand rested instinctively on her growing belly, a small gesture that felt both tender and intentional. The guests smiled and nodded, some raising their glasses in a toast. Dan leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, a faint smile on his lips, as if he were enjoying the praise by association. "Tonight is about celebrating family, the past, the present, and the future," she continued. "And as part of that, I thought it would be nice to share something I put together, a slideshow of memories, moments that have defined our journey." She gestured to the screen that had been discreetly set up at the front of the room. The lights dimmed slightly, and the first image appeared on the screen, a photo of Chloe and Dan on their wedding day, laughing as they danced under a canopy of fairy lights. There were murmurs of appreciation and smiles from the crowd as the slideshow continued, moving through milestones. Their honeymoon, birthdays, holidays, and heartfelt moments at home. Dan's shoulders seemed to relax even more as he watched, his expression one of quiet contentment. But then halfway through, the tone shifted. The next image was not of happy memories or cherished moments. It was a photo of Dan and Alana sitting at a dimly lit table in a cozy restaurant, his hand resting lightly on hers. The room went silent. The image held for a moment before transitioning to another, this time a screenshot of a text message exchange. The affectionate words between Dan and Alana were unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd, low murmurs broke the silence as the slideshow continued. Photos of Dan and Alana at intimate dinners, receipts for extravagant gifts, and more incriminating evidence appeared one after another, each more damning than the last. Chloe stood in the center of it all, her expression calm but unwavering, her gaze fixed on Dan. Dan, frozen in his seat, gripped his wine glass so tightly it seemed it might shatter. His face drained of color as the realization of what was happening washed over him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The room seemed to close in on him, the whispers and stares of the guests like daggers. Chloe waited until the last image faded from the screen before she spoke, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "Dan, while I was busy carrying our child and building a home for our family, you were busy building lives with someone else." Dan's head snapped to her, his eyes wide and desperate. "Chloe, No," she interrupted, raising a hand. "Don't you dare insult me by pretending there's an explanation for this." "Alana," she said, turning her attention to the young woman, "you told me that you and Dan were separated. What a funny little lie that was." The young woman, who had been sitting near the back of the room, now looked completely mortified. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she looked at Dan. "Dan," she whispered, her voice shaky. "What is she talking about? You said you were separated." Chloe's eyes were sharp and firm as she confronted Alana. "Separated," she said, her voice tinged with cold incredulity. "That's funny. That's news to me and the baby we're expecting together." Alana's eyes widened with horror as the weight of Chloe's words sank in. "You lied to me." Her voice barely audible, her gaze fixed on Dan. "You told me. I can explain," Dan stammered, his voice breaking as he looked between Chloe and Alana. "This isn't what it looks like." "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," Chloe said. Her voice rose slightly, though her tone remained firm. "You lied to her, you lied to me, and now everyone here knows exactly who you are." The guests, once warm and smiling, now looked at Dan with a mixture of shock and disdain. His parents exchanged mortified glances, his colleagues whispered among themselves, and Chloe's family watched in stunned silence. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she turned to address the crowd once more. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice calm and serene, despite the storm inside her. "I think it's safe to say that this evening has been enlightening." With that, she walked away, her head held high, leaving Dan to face the weight of his own betrayal. The room was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. Dan was left in the center of it all, his face pale, his eyes moving from one expression of horror to another. The charm he used to wear as armor now cracked, leaving only panic and desperation in its place. "It was a mistake," Dan blurted, his words tumbling over each other. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just got carried away by things, and it doesn't mean anything." Chloe was not moved. She slowly approached, her heels making a soft click against the floor, and held out an elegant manila folder. Dan's eyes darted nervously toward it, as if it might bite. "This isn't just a mistake, Dan. It's a pattern, and I'm done pretending that it's not." Her hand didn't tremble as she held out the folder. "Inside are the divorce papers. I've already spoken to a lawyer. You made your choices, Dan. Now I'm making mine for myself and our baby." Dan hesitated, his hand hovering over the folder, as if it were laced with poison. "Chloe, please," he stammered, his voice breaking. "You don't have to do this. We can fix this. Can I fix this?" "Fix this?" Chloe repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You don't even know what that means. If you had cared about fixing anything, we wouldn't be here. But you didn't, Dan. You didn't care about me or our family. You cared about yourself." The crowd, now captivated by the unfolding drama, was silent. Alana, who had been frozen by the doorway, finally found her voice. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Dan, her expression a mix of anguish and anger. "You lied to me," she said, her voice shaky. "You told me you were separated. You said you wanted a future with me." Dan turned to her, his desperation shifting. "Alana, he began, but she cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. "No," she snapped. Her voice rose. "Don't you dare try to explain this to me. I trusted you, Dan. I gave you everything, and this is what I get, finding out like this in front of everyone." She turned to the doorway, her heels clicking angrily against the floor as she stormed out. Just before she left, she threw one last look over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "You're nothing but a liar. I hope it was worth it." The door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the room as a final punctuation mark on Dan's humiliation. He stood there, frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and shame. His colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances, his parents looked mortified, and Chloe's friends offered subtle gestures of support. Dan turned to Chloe, his voice barely a whisper. "Chloe, please don't do this. I love you." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe the ghost of the love they once shared, but it was gone as quickly as it had arrived. She straightened her posture, her hand resting instinctively on her belly. "No, Dan, you don't love me. If you did, we wouldn't be here. You loved the idea of me, of us, but I'm not going to let you drag me down anymore. I deserve better. Our baby deserves better." With that, Chloe turned and walked away, leaving Dan alone, his world crumbling around him. The whispers grew louder, the judgment palpable as the crowd began to disperse. Chloe didn't look back. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt free. Her steps were firm, her resolve unwavering. This was her beginning, and she wasn't going to let Dan's betrayal define her story. Not anymore. The path forward, the courtroom was eerily silent, the air heavy with tension. Dan sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his jaw set as his high-profile lawyer whispered something in his ear. He nodded stiffly, though he wasn't really listening. His gaze kept drifting to Chloe, who sat across the room at her own table, her expression calm but resolute. She avoided his eyes, her focus entirely on the folder of documents her lawyer was organizing. The proceedings had dragged on for weeks. Each day felt like an eternity for both of them. Dan had entered confidently at first, convinced that his lawyer's reputation and his own carefully crafted image would be enough to sway the court. He had told himself he was doing this for his child, that he deserved a chance to be a part of their life. But as the evidence that Chloe's lawyer presented began to mount, that confidence crumbled. photos, text messages, financial records. Chloe's lawyer painted a damning picture of Dan's infidelity and emotional abandonment, weaving a narrative that left little room for rebuttal. Each piece of evidence was like a stone dropping into the still water of Dan's defense, creating ripples he couldn't control. "Your Honor," Chloe's lawyer said, her voice clear and firm, "the evidence speaks for itself. My client has dedicated herself to creating a stable, loving environment for her child. Mr. Dan, on the other hand, has demonstrated a pattern of behavior that shows a lack of commitment and responsibility. It is in the child's best interest to grant primary custody to Mrs. Chloe." Dan's lawyer attempted to counter, arguing that his client was remorseful and ready to be a devoted father. "Mr. Dan acknowledges his mistakes," she said, her tone persuasive, "and is committed to making amends. He deserves the opportunity to share custody and be an active part of his child's life." But the judge's expression remained impartial. Her gaze moved between the two parties as she considered the argument. When the time finally came for her to deliver her verdict, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. "After reviewing the evidence and considering the testimonies, I find that it is in the best interest of the child to grant primary custody to Mrs. Chloe," the judge began, her voice firm but measured. "Mr. Dan will be granted limited visitation rights, supervised if necessary, and is ordered to pay child support to ensure the child's well-being." Dan's stomach churned as the words sank in. He felt a surge of anger, of frustration, but most of all, of shame. He looked toward Chloe, hoping to catch her eye, to find some hint of the woman who had once believed in him, but she did not look at him. She was already gathering her things. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something in her ear, which made her nod in silent agreement. As the courtroom emptied, Dan remained frozen in his seat. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a few words of comfort, but he barely heard them. His thoughts were a blur, fragments of regret and guilt swirling as he tried to process what had just happened. Later that night, Dan found himself sitting alone in the house that had once been filled with life. The silence was deafening. The furniture felt colder, emptier, stripped of the warmth Chloe had once brought to the space. On the coffee table was the ultrasound picture she had left behind, the one he had barely paid attention to before. He picked it up now, his fingers trembling as he traced the edges. For the first time, he really looked at it, the tiny form that was supposed to be his future, his family. Tears blurred his vision as he thought of all the moments he had already missed and all the ones he would never have. The first steps, the first words, the small milestones he had taken for granted. When he still had a chance to be there, he looked around the room. His gaze landed on the photo frames Chloe hadn't taken with her. Their wedding photo looked back at him, the joy on her face a cruel reminder of what he had thrown away. The friends who used to fill this house with laughter had drifted away. Their calls and invitations slowly faded after the truth came to light. Even his parents had expressed their disappointment, their disapproval evident in the cold tone of their last conversation. Dan sank deeper into the sofa. The weight of his choices pressed in on him like a physical burden. He thought about the man he used to be, the promises he had made to Chloe, the dreams they had shared. And then he thought about the man he had become, selfish, careless, blind to what truly mattered. For the first time, he saw the full cost of his actions, the family he had lost, the love he had destroyed, the life he had thrown away. And as he sat there, the ultrasound picture clutched tightly in his hand. The tears finally came, a bitter torrent of regret and understanding. In the stillness of that empty house, Dan was left with nothing but the echoes of what could have been, and the knowledge that he had no one to blame but himself. A new beginning Chloe didn't waste a second moving forward. The small house was filled with the gentle hum of new beginnings. Sunlight streamed through the windows, dancing on the freshly painted walls and the delicate patterns of the baby blankets hanging from a cot. Chloe stood in the living room, hands on her hips, surveying the boxes that still waited to be unpacked. She smiled to herself, a quiet, genuine smile that came from deep within. This was hers, all of it, a home she had chosen, built with love and purpose for herself and her baby. The last few months had been a whirlwind. Moving into this house felt like a turning point, a step into a life she had reclaimed as her own. She unpacked a box marked nursery, pulling out soft pastel decorations and tiny onesies that made her heart swell. Carefully, she placed them in the drawers she had assembled one night with a friend, the two of them laughing as they tried to make sense of the instructions. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Sarah, an old college friend she had recently reconnected with. "Lunch tomorrow, my shout. Can't wait to see you." Chloe smiled as she replied, "Wouldn't miss it. See you then." It felt good to reconnect with the people who mattered, the ones who had always seen her for who she truly was. The baby's room was coming together beautifully, the soft tones of lavender and cream creating a peaceful, cozy space. As she hung a picture above the cot, her hand rested on her belly, now round and full of life. She spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper, as if her baby could already hear her. "We're going to be okay," she said. "Better than okay. You'll see." The weeks went by in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Then, on one crisp morning, her baby arrived. The labor was long and exhausting, but the moment she held her daughter in her arms, everything else faded away. Tears streamed down Chloe's face as she looked at the tiny, perfect features of her newborn. "Hello," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse with emotion. "It's just us now, little one, and we're going to do great." Back at home, the first few days were a mixture of sleepless nights and quiet joy. Chloe rocked her daughter in the nursery. The soft glow of a nightlight illuminated the room. The baby cooed in her arms, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly around Chloe's. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, inhaling the sweet scent of new life. One morning, Chloe stood by the window, holding her baby as the first rays of sun crept over the horizon. The warmth of the light kissed her skin, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had been through so much: heartbreak, betrayal, uncertainty. But here she was, standing tall, strong, holding her future in her arms. Her days became more full, more rich. She started working part-time for a local gallery in Sydney, helping to curate exhibits while balancing the joys and challenges of motherhood. It wasn't the big career she had once imagined, but it was meaningful, and it gave her a sense of purpose. The gallery director had already hinted at a bigger role in the future, and Chloe felt the quiet excitement of possibility. Friends also began to fill her life again. Sarah would often stop by, bringing coffee and lending a hand when Chloe needed a break. They would sit in the living room, laughing and reminiscing, while Chloe's daughter slept peacefully nearby. It felt as though Chloe's world, once shattered, was slowly coming back together piece by piece. One night, Chloe sat at her desk, her baby asleep in the cot beside her. She opened her journal, the same one she had written in months ago when everything felt hopeless. This time, her words were different. "Life breaks us, yes, but it also gives us a choice to either stay broken or to rise. I chose to rise for myself, for my daughter, for the life we deserve. And I've learned that strength doesn't come from never falling. It comes from getting up, again and again." She closed the journal and looked at her daughter. Her heart swelled with love. "We did it," she whispered. "We are free." The story ends with Chloe, but her journey does not. It's only just beginning, filled with new challenges, joys, and moments of silent triumph. She chose to rise, and in doing so, she found herself again. So, what would you do in Chloe's shoes? Would you have exposed Dan in the same way, or would you have opted for a more private confrontation? Dan's story shows that impulsive decisions can have devastating consequences. Do you think his regret at the end is sincere, or is he just regretting the consequences? And how does Alana's perspective influence your opinion of the whole messy situation? If you enjoyed this story of resilience and empowerment, smash that like button, comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring Aussie stories. Cheers.